What if the oldest words ever written weren't about how humanity began, but about how it almost didn't survive? What if the first historians weren't telling myths, but leaving warnings? Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the soil turns to clay under your hands, archaeologists in the early 20th century began unearthing cities that had been buried for nearly 5,000 years. Ur, Uruk, Kish, Shuruppak. They expected gradual development, pottery improving slowly, walls getting thicker, writing evolving from pictures to symbols. What they found instead were layers, thick bands of clean silt, sterile and sudden, separating one occupation from another. No artifacts, no gradual decay, just sediment, the kind left behind when water settles after chaos. And above these layers, new cities rose, built directly on top of the ruins. The people who rebuilt them left records. Thousands of clay tablets baked hard by time, pressed with wedge-shaped marks that still carry the rhythm of the hands that made them. If you look closely at certain tablets in museum collections, you can still see fingerprints, ridges preserved in clay before it dried, left by a scribe who lived when these cities were young. Before I go further, take a moment to subscribe if you're drawn to history that lives in the space between evidence and memory. And leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I like to imagine this unfolding quietly across time zones, carried into sleep by voices that have been silent for millennia. The tablets these scribes left behind are not poetic. They are not vague. They are lists, kings and cities, reign lengths and disasters written in the same administrative style used for grain taxes and temple inventories, and they all share one feature. They divide history into two eras. The document is called the Sumerian King List. Copies of it have been found across Mesopotamia, some dating to the early 2nd millennium BC, but referencing kings far older. It opens with a simple chronological structure. Kings ruled, cities flourished, time passed, and then in the middle of the list, a single sentence appears. Then the flood swept over. After that line, everything changes. The kings who come after have realistic reign lengths. 10 years, 15, 30. The cities are recognizable, their locations confirmed by excavation. History, as we understand it, begins. But before that sentence, the list records something else. Kings with reigns lasting thousands of years, cities whose locations have never been found. A world described in the same bureaucratic tone, but belonging to a time that feels older than memory. This isn't legend dressed as history. The Sumerians used the same cuneiform script, the same grammatical structure, the same archival system for both eras. They treated the pre-flood kings as they treated the post-flood rulers, part of the record. The question is, what were they recording? When archaeologists reached the deepest layers of Shuruppak, one of the cities named in the King List, they found exactly what the text described. A thick deposit of flood silt dated to approximately 2900 BC, separating earlier settlement layers from later reconstruction. The same pattern appeared at Ur, at Kish, at other sites along the floodplain. Sudden destruction, sterile sediment, and then above it, rebuilding. The cities that rose afterward weren't smaller or more primitive. They were planned. Agricultural systems resumed. Temples were rebuilt, often on the exact foundations of older ones, as though the survivors were restoring what they remembered. And shortly after these flood layers, something else appears in the archaeological record. Writing, not experimental marks or gradual symbol systems, but cuneiform already structured, already capable of recording complex information. The earliest tablets contain accounts and inventories, but within a few generations, the script expands. History, kingship, mythology, chronology. It's as though the need to preserve memory became urgent after the waters receded. The scribes who copied the King List centuries later treated it as sacred archive. They didn't change the pre-flood section. They didn't rationalize it or remove it. They preserved it. Exactly, even when it conflicted with their understanding of time. One tablet found in the ruins of Nippur contains a marginal note written by a scribe. I have written what was written before me, not what was imagined, not what was invented, what was written before. Memory passed down through clay. The flood in Sumerian records isn't described as the creation of the world. It's a rupture, a reset. Civilization existed before it, and civilization resumed after. The King List makes this explicit. Kingship didn't begin with the flood. It descended again afterward as though it were being restored. There's a word used in some of the temple dedications from this period. Restoration, not construction, not founding. Restoration of what had been. If the Sumerians were rebuilding, what exactly had been destroyed? And how did they remember it clearly enough to write it down 5,000 years ago in documents we can still read today? This isn't a story about lost continents or ancient technologies. It's quieter than that and stranger. It's about a people who experienced catastrophe, survived it, and made the deliberate choice to record what came before so it wouldn't be forgotten. They carved that memory into clay, and the clay has outlasted empires. The story of how we found those tablets begins not in ancient Sumer, but in the dry wind and broken tales of southern Iraq, where the ground itself holds layers older than language. The story of how we found those tablets begins not in ancient Sumer, but in the dry wind and broken tales of southern Iraq, where the ground itself holds layers older than language. In 1899, German archaeologists arrived at Uruk expecting to confirm what seemed obvious, that civilization had started small, a few huts, crude pottery, trial and error, the slow accumulation of knowledge over centuries. Instead, they uncovered a city, not a village that grew into a city, but a planned settlement. 6 miles of walls enclosing monumental temples, administrative buildings, and residential quarters laid out in geometric precision. The deeper they dug, the more structured it became. And beneath the earliest occupation levels, they found something they hadn't anticipated: flood silt. Thick, sterile layers with no artifacts, no pottery, no signs of gradual abandonment, just sediment left behind when water settles after violence. The same pattern appeared at Eridu, the city the Sumerians themselves called the oldest. Beneath the temple complex dedicated to Enki, god of fresh water and wisdom, excavators found alternating layers: occupation, then flood silt, then rebuilding, not once but multiple times, as though the city had drowned and been resurrected across centuries. At archaeologist Leonard Woolley discovered an 11 ft thick deposit of clean clay separating two distinct civilizations. He called it evidence of the flood. His colleagues were skeptical until identical layers appeared at Kish, at Shuruppak, at Lagos, cities separated by miles, all carrying the same scar. And above these scars, in every case, the cities returned. But they returned with something new: writing. The tablets found in the post-flood layers weren't primitive experiments. The script was already systematic, capable of recording contracts, temple dedications, astronomical observations, and kings. It appeared as though the survivors had emerged from catastrophe with the urgent need to make sure nothing would be forgotten again. But if Sumer was rebuilding, what exactly had been destroyed before their history began? The answer is written in a document the Sumerians copied for over 1,000 years, as though forgetting it would be dangerous. It's called the Sumerian King List. Fragments of it have been found in multiple cities. Nippur, Lhasa, is each version slightly different in detail, but identical in structure. Scribes treated it the way modern archivists treat constitutional records, something that must be preserved exactly even when it stops making sense. The document opens with a list of kings, 8 rulers, 5 cities. Their reigns are recorded in the same grammatical structure used for grain inventories and temple expenses. No poetry, no metaphor, just names, locations, and numbers. But the numbers are impossible. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alalgar of Eridu, 36,000 years. And Menluana of Bad Tibira, 43,200 years. The list continues this way through 8 kings, their combined reigns spanning nearly 250,000 years, and then without warning, the text shifts. Then the flood swept over. One sentence, no elaboration, no description of water, or destruction, or divine wrath. Just a single bureaucratic statement, as though the scribe were noting a change in administration. After that line, everything becomes recognizable. Jushur of Kish, 1,200 years. Still long, but within the realm of exaggeration. Then Kalasinabel, 960 years. Then Nangish Lishma, 670 years. Within a few generations, reign lengths drop to 30, 20, 18 years. Numbers that match the lifespans of real human rulers confirmed by archaeology. The tone of the document never changes. Pre-flood and post-flood kings are recorded in the same style using the same verb forms, the same administrative precision. There is no indication the scribes considered one section mythical and the other historical. They wrote it as though both were memory. Why would a supposedly mythical flood be treated as a historical boundary instead of a legend? The flood the scribes recorded wasn't only preserved in text. It left a scar in the earth itself. At Shuruppak, the city where the King List places one of the pre-flood rulers, excavators in the 1930s dug through occupation layers expecting continuity. What they found instead was a sharp break, a sterile band of yellow clay nearly 5 ft thick, separating earlier settlement from later rebuilding. No pottery shards, no ash, no gradual decline. Just sediment, uniform, and clean. The kind deposited when floodwater stands still long enough to let silt settle before receding. The same layer appeared at Kish. Then at where Leonard Woolley measured an 11 ft deposit of water-laid clay with no cultural material inside it. At Uruk, the sequence repeated. Occupation, flood silt, reconstruction. The cities were not abandoned and left empty. They drowned. And then after the water left, they were rebuilt on top of their own ruins. Radiocarbon dating placed these flood events around 2900 BC near the end of the early dynastic period. Not a single catastrophic deluge across all of Mesopotamia at once, but overlapping regional floods severe enough to destroy urban centers and force survivors to start again. What makes the pattern strange is the continuity. The people who rebuilt Shuruppak used the same temple foundations. The pottery styles didn't change. The agricultural tools remained identical. This wasn't invasion or replacement. It was recovery. The same population returned to the same locations and resumed the same way of life as though they were restoring what they remembered rather than inventing something new. And within a generation of these rebuilding phases, cuneiform writing appears in the archaeological record, not hesitant or experimental, but structured and capable of recording kingship law and chronology. If the flood was real and devastating, how did survivors remember and transmit what came before? Writing didn't begin as literature. It began as insurance. The earliest form tablets found in Uruk and dated to approximately 3200 BC are accounting records. Grain allotments, livestock counts, temple inventories, mundane, practical, necessary. But within a few generations, something shifts. The same script that tracked Bali begins recording kings, then laws, then cosmology, then history, specifically the history of what came before the flood. This expansion happens rapidly, almost urgently, in the centuries following the flood layers. At sites across Sumer, the volume of written material explodes. temples establish scribal schools. Young students copy the same texts over and over, not for practice alone, but for preservation. To be a scribe was to be a guardian of memory, entrusted with ensuring that certain knowledge would outlast the people who held it. Oral tradition could preserve stories, but it was vulnerable. A single lost generation, a single catastrophic event, and centuries of accumulated knowledge could vanish. Clay, however, survives fire. It survives water. It survives neglect. Once baked, it becomes nearly indestructible. The Sumerians understood this. One tablet from Nippur contains a colophon, a scribal note at the end of a text that reads, "Whoever destroys this tablet may enluft, but against forgetting." The tablet itself was sacred not because of divine content, but because it carried memory forward. Another text, a hymn to the goddess Nisaba, patron of scribes, describes writing as the art that illuminates the darkness, not metaphorical darkness. Historical darkness. The void left when memory fails. The King List was copied repeatedly across centuries, often with marginal notes indicating the scribe had transcribed it from an older, damaged version. Each copy was an act of rescue. What kinds of memories were so important that they had to be preserved forever? The oldest version of the flood story doesn't belong to Noah. It belongs to a man named Zu-Sudra. His name appears in a fragmentary Eri tablet known as the Eridu Genesis, dated to approximately 1700 BC, but referencing traditions far older. The text is damaged, large sections missing, but what remains is striking in its tone. There is no divine rage, no moral judgment, just a practical warning and a practical response. Zu-Sudra is described as a king of Shuruppak, the same city where archaeologists found floods silt separating occupation layers. In the text, the god Enki warns him that the other gods have decided to send a flood to destroy humanity. Enki does not explain why. He simply instructs Zura to build a large boat, seal it with bitumen, and bring aboard his family, livestock, and seeds. Zu-Sudra obeys. The flood comes. It lasts 7 days and 7 nights. When the water recedes, Zudra makes offerings, and the gods grant him eternal life, not as reward for heroism, but for preserving what would have been lost. The story is not about survival through strength. It's about survival through obedience and foresight. Sudra doesn't fight the flood. He prepares for it, and what he saves is not just himself, but continuity. Animals, agriculture, knowledge. The gods in the text function as narrative structure, not scientific explanation. Ancient listeners would have understood them as the forces that governed water, weather, and fate. Stripping them away leaves the core, a catastrophic flood, advance warning, deliberate preparation, and the preservation of civilization's essentials. What makes the text unusual is its specificity. The boat's dimensions are given, the materials are listed, the duration is measured. Even the location Shuruppak is named, and that city's ruins carry physical evidence of flooding. This isn't allegory dressed as history. It reads like memory passed through the language available at the time. Why does this same survival story appear again and again across later civilizations? The story didn't stay in Sumer. By the time Akkadian scribes began writing in the early 2nd millennium BC, Zusra had become Atapishtim. The flood narrative was incorporated into the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known works of literature. The structure remains identical. A righteous man receives divine warning, builds a boat to specific dimensions, saves his family and animals, survives a catastrophic deluge, and is granted immortality as thanks for preserving life. The details shift slightly. The duration changes. The gods' motivations are elaborated, but the core sequence, warning, preparation, flood, survival, renewal, stays intact across 1,000 years of retelling. Then the story moves west. The Hebrew account appears in Genesis, written sometime between the 10th and 6th centuries BC. The hero is now Noah. The flood lasts 40 days. The theological framing is different, monotheistic rather than polytheistic, but the narrative beats are unmistakable. A flood destroys the world. One man is warned. He builds an ark. He brings animals aboard. The waters recede. Humanity begins again. Scholars have long noted the similarities between the Gilgamesh flood and the Genesis flood. The conventional explanation is borrowing that Hebrew scribes encountered Mesopotamian traditions during the Babylonian exile and adapted them. But that doesn't explain why the same story appears in cultures with no contact with Mesopotamia. In the Indian Rig Veda and later Puranic texts, a figure named Manu is warned by a fish that a great flood will destroy all life. He builds a boat, ties it to the fish's horn, and is guided to safety. When the waters recede, Manu becomes the progenitor of the post-flood human race. In ancient Greece, Deucalion survives a flood sent by Zeus by building a chest and floating until the waters subside. He and his wife Pura repopulate the earth afterward. In China, the legend of Gun Yu describes catastrophic flooding that fuai the land, requiring massive engineering projects to drain the waters and restore civilization. Among indigenous peoples of the Americas, from the Hopi to the Maya to the Mapuche, flood traditions describe worlds destroyed by water, with small groups surviving to rebuild. These are not vague references to rain or rivers. They describe world-ending deluges, survival through foresight, and the resumption of human society afterward. The structural consistency is unsettling. Advance warning, a vessel, the saving of animals or seeds, a marker of divine favor, and the burden of rebuilding. Geographic separation should have produced different stories. Cultural isolation should have led to unique mythologies. Instead, we find thematic coherence across continents, across millennia, across languages that share no common root. Either these civilizations independently invented the same narrative, which seems unlikely given the specificity, or they inherited it from a shared memory older than any of them. If so many cultures remembered the same disaster, how far back does this memory truly reach? The pre-flood kings ruled for spans no human could witness. 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. These numbers appear in the King List with the same grammatical certainty as the post-flood reigns of 15 or 20 years. The scribes who copied them didn't flag them as symbolic. They didn't add qualifiers or explanations. They simply recorded them. Modern scholars have proposed that these figures represent something other than individual lifespans, perhaps dynasties or entire eras compressed into single names. A king who ruled for 30,000 years might represent a lineage, a cultural epic, or a period of stability that lasted so long it exceeded the memory span of oral tradition. But that raises a different question. Why record it at all? If these numbers were pure invention, there would be no reason to preserve them with such consistency across multiple copies spanning centuries. If they were symbolic, the Sumerians could have used rounder figures, 10,000, 50,000, 100,000. Instead, the numbers are oddly specific, 28,800, 36,000, 43,200. These feel like attempts to quantify something that resisted normal measurement. Consider how difficult it is to describe deep time without mathematics. How would you convey the passage of centuries if your calendar only went back a few generations? How would you express the age of something? If your longest unit of measurement was a human lifetime, the Sumerians may have been doing what humans always do when memory stretches beyond the reach of direct experience. They assigned numbers that felt appropriately vast, even if they couldn't be precise. But there's another detail often overlooked. The pre-flood section of the King List doesn't just record long reigns. It records cities: Eridu, Bad, Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak. 5 cities, 8 kings. Some of these cities, Eridu, Shurupak, have been excavated. Their ruins go deep. Beneath the flood layers at Eridu, archaeologists found 18 successive temple rebuildings, each constructed on top of the previous one, stretching back into the Ubaid period around 5000 BC. 18 temples rebuilt again and again in the same sacred location. Each rebuilding implies continuity, memory, reverence for what came before. The site wasn't abandoned and resettled randomly. It was maintained across millennia. If the pre-flood kings represent the accumulated memory of those rebuildings, generations upon generations of priests, leaders, and communities, then the long reigns begin to make sense, not as literal lifespans, but as the only way early scribes could express the immense depth of time they were trying to honor. The flood didn't just destroy cities. It severed the continuity that made a deep memory possible. After the flood, time becomes measurable. Kings rule for decades, not millennia. History becomes chronological rather than epical. The transition in the King List marks not just a change in record-keeping, but a change in the relationship between memory and time itself. If pre-flood time was remembered differently, what exactly was lost when the waters came? The cities that rose after the flood were different, not in their location, but in their intention. At Uruk, the post-flood settlement wasn't scattered or improvised. It was planned. Streets ran in geometric patterns. Temples were aligned to celestial markers. Irrigation channels were engineered with precision, designed to control water rather than merely react to it. The survivors rebuilt as though they had learned something fundamental about chaos and the need for order. This wasn't just reconstruction, it was redesign. Agriculture resumed immediately. Barley, wheat, dates, and livestock, all the staples of Sumerian life, reappear in the archaeological record within generations of the flood layers. But the way they're managed changes. Texts from the early dynastic period describe centralized grain storage, rationing systems, and detailed crop rotation schedules. The administration of food becomes formalized as though famine or the memory of it was too dangerous to risk again. At the same time, law codes begin to emerge. The earliest known legal texts come from the post-flood era. The laws of Uramu dated to approximately 2100 BC, and the slightly later code of Lipid Ishtar established standardized punishments, property rights, and social obligations. These aren't just practical regulations, they're philosophical statements about fairness, order, and predictability in a world that had proven itself capable of sudden destruction. The tone of these laws is striking. They emphasize restoration over retribution, compensation rather than revenge. The goal isn't merely justice, it's stability. A society that had survived catastrophe was now structuring itself to prevent internal collapse. Religion shifts in parallel. Pre-flood Sumerian worship, as far as we can reconstruct it, was localized, each city venerating its own patron deity with its own rituals. After the flood, a pantheon emerges with clearly defined roles. Enlil governs the wind and kingship. Enki controls fresh water and wisdom. Inanna oversees love and war. Each god has jurisdiction, responsibility, and limits. This structuring reflects something deeper. The belief that chaos must be governed, that forces beyond human control require negotiation and appeasement, and that survival depends on maintaining balance between competing powers. Temples become the centers of economic and intellectual life. They store grain, employ scribes, train priests, and archive records. Religious sites double as administrative hubs, suggesting that memory itself had become sacred. To forget was seen as dangerous, not just spiritually, but practically. And then there's the most revealing change, the institutionalization of memory. Scribal schools appear throughout Sumer in the centuries following the flood. Students spend years learning cuneiform, copying ancient texts, memorizing king lists, hymns, and chronicles. Education becomes formalized not just for literacy, but for continuity. The role of the scribe shifts from clerk to guardian. Their task isn't simply to record the present, it's to preserve the past so it can never be lost again. One tablet from Napper, a student exercise from around 1800 BC, contains a copied excerpt from the King List. At the bottom, the young scribe has added a note in smaller script. I have written what the old tablet said, not what the teacher dictated, not what tradition claimed, what the old tablet said. The written word had become authoritative, more trustworthy than living memory, because living memory could be severed by disaster. The survivors didn't just rebuild cities and plant crops. They built systems designed to outlast catastrophe, legal frameworks, religious structures, educational institutions, and archives. They constructed civilization as though they knew it could end again and wanted to leave something behind that would allow the next generation to start from knowledge rather than ignorance. What lesson did the survivors believe humanity must never forget again? The Sumerian records were never meant to tell us how the world began. They were meant to tell us how it nearly ended and what it took to start again. When we call these texts the oldest written documents in history, we frame them as firsts, the first writing, the first cities, the first civilization. But the Sumerians themselves didn't see it that way. They saw themselves as restorers, not inventors. Their chronicles open not with creation, but with catastrophe. Their king lists don't celebrate origins. They mark a rupture. We've spent centuries treating ancient texts as mythology when they may have been doing something more urgent, preserving memory after trauma. The flood layers in the earth are real. The king list's division of time is explicit. The post-flood expansion of writing, law, and institutional memory is documented. These aren't disconnected facts. They're a sequence, one that suggests the Sumerians experienced something so devastating it changed how they understood their place in time. Before the flood, memory was deep but unmeasured. Kings with impossibly long reigns, cities that stretched back into epochs. Time felt different because it wasn't counted. It was accumulated, passed down through generations in ways that blurred individual lifespans into collective continuity. After the flood, time became chronological. Reigns shortened to human scales. Events were dated. Records were kept with obsessive precision. The shift isn't stylistic, it's psychological. Societies that survive catastrophe often emerge with a compulsion to document to ensure that knowledge won't be lost again if disaster returns. Writing itself may be the clearest evidence of this. Cuneiform doesn't appear gradually, it doesn't evolve slowly from primitive scratches into complex sentences. It emerges already functional, already capable of recording not just trade, but law, history, and cosmology. This has puzzled scholars for over a century. Why would writing appear so suddenly? And why would it immediately be used for preservation rather than just commerce? The answer may be simpler than we've allowed ourselves to consider, because the people who developed it had something they desperately needed to preserve. The earliest tablets after the flood layers contain grain records. Yes, but also king lists, temple dedications, and hymns. Within generations, scribes are copying older texts, students are memorizing chronicles, and archives are being established in temple complexes. This isn't the slow crawl of invention. It's the urgent work of recovery. Consider the colophons, those all scribal notes at the end of tablets. I have written what was written before me, copied from an old damaged tablet. May this not be forgotten. These aren't just procedural notes. They're anxiety formalized. The scribes weren't recording the present. They were rescuing the past. And what they rescued wasn't just names and numbers, it was the structure of time itself. The King List is often dismissed as a mixture of myth and history. But that framing misses what makes it remarkable. The document doesn't claim the flood ended the world. It says kingship continued afterward. Cities were rebuilt. Life resumed. But the continuity had been broken, and the scribes made sure that break would be visible forever. Then the flood swept over. That single sentence is the hinge of recorded history. Everything before it belongs to memory that can no longer be fully verified. Everything after it belongs to the world we recognize, cities we've excavated, kings whose reigns match archaeological evidence, events that left physical traces. The flood didn't create civilization. It interrupted it. And the response to that interruption was to build systems that could survive the next one. Laws were written down so they couldn't be reinterpreted or forgotten. Temples became archives. Scribes became priests of memory. Religion structured itself around order and balance as though chaos had proven itself too dangerous to leave ungoverned. Every institution that emerged in post-flood Sumer was designed to resist oblivion. This reframes what we mean when we talk about progress. We tend to think of civilization as humanity's climb from ignorance to knowledge, from simplicity to complexity. But the Sumerians didn't see themselves climbing. They saw themselves rebuilding. Their own texts say kingship descended after the flood as though it had existed before and was being restored. That word restoration appears in temple inscriptions, in dedicatory tablets, in references to older foundations. The Sumerians treated their cities as reconstructions of something earlier, whether that something was a literal pre-flood civilization or simply the accumulated knowledge of countless generations lost to disaster. The effect is the same. They understood themselves as heirs to interrupted continuity, and they took that responsibility seriously. The flood stories that spread across the ancient world, Akkadian, Hebrew, Greek, Indian, aren't just borrowed myths. They're echoes of a shared understanding that catastrophe had happened before and could happen again. The survival narratives all emphasize the same themes: foresight, preparation, preservation of knowledge, and the responsibility to rebuild. Zudra, Utnishtim, Noah, Manu. Each figure is granted survival, not as a reward, but as a duty. They aren't heroes in the traditional sense. They're custodians. Their task isn't to conquer the flood, but to carry memory through it. This is why the story survived for so long. It wasn't entertainment, it was instruction. The Sumerian scribes who copied the King List across centuries weren't preserving mythology. They were maintaining an archive of what had been learned the hard way. That memory is fragile, that catastrophe is real, and that the only defense against oblivion is the deliberate act of preservation. The clay tablets they left behind are more than historical documents. They're acts of resistance against forgetting, against erasure, against the void that opens when continuity breaks. We stand now on the other side of that decision. 5,000 years later, holding fragments of their memory in our hands, reading words pressed into clay by people who understood that survival wasn't enough. What mattered was what survived with you. History does not begin with creation. It begins with survival and the decision to remember. The fingerprints pressed into those tablets are still visible, the wedge marks still legible, the memory still intact. Not because it was carved in stone, but because someone long ago decided it was worth preserving. And every time we read those texts, we prove them right.